Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Peel from East Sussex Fire and Rescue Service. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time. Yeah, just little introductions. I work in training and assurance within the protection team. And since things have happened in fire safety, namely, of course, Grenfell, and that our team has grown to try and tackle a lot of the ongoing issues. But briefly, I'm going to. We're also joined in the room by other colleagues from our primary authority partnership, who you'll get to hear from later. You've heard from Scott Saunders, who's training insurance as well, and our head of protection, George O'Reilly, will take over in a second and take you through the deck of slides that we've produced. But just briefly, that the aim of this session really was to. We've had a significant amount of changes in fire safety over the years, and particularly since 2020. Of course, you're aware of Fire Safety Act, Building Safety Act, Fire Safety England regs. There's going to be changes to approved documents. We've now got new Grenfell recommendations that are going to be sifting and making their way to yourselves and us. And what we're going to do is, this is, as Scott Saunders already mentioned, this is the first of our seminars where we're going to try and help you out there in industry to sort of work with us, because that's as much as we're the enforcing authority, our first line of sort of communication is always to educate and help you improve and get better in the fire safety realms. So we do welcome questions. I understand there might be some people that are in this room now that are from just local small businesses, for example. They might have other requirements. Conversely, sitting on the other side of the fence, you might have people that are managing large numbers of high-rise buildings. So we've sort of set it at a level of introductory, really, just where it sort of just takes you through, or how did we get here? How does all the legislation fit together? And yes, there is you have the opportunity to raise questions in the Q&A session at the end. I might be told not to include this, but I would say if you've got any really pertinent things, put them in the chat with at the Q&A session, because we've got quite a lot to get through. So make a note of it. We can also obviously refer back to slides. There's not a huge amount of slides, but anyway, we hope you get a lot from it. But yeah, don't hold back, even if you think the question is not applicable or not at the right level. We'll do our best to help you. Anyway, so to you, George, if that's okay, just to start the presentation, where we're going to sort of look into the legal framework and how it all fits together.
Sure. Thank you, James. Good afternoon, everyone. There are some familiar faces on the call. I hope you're all well. Lovely to see you all. We go to the next slide, please. James has taken us through that introduction, but it is around the lines of how did we get to Grenfell? What did we learn from Grenfell? What do we expect from responsible persons to comply with the legislation as it stands now? What common issues are we finding, and where there is some support out there to help you. James mentioned us, but there's a lot of other support I'm sure you are aware of. We will point you in the right direction for that towards the end. And then a Q&A at the end, which just be gentle on me, please, with the Q&A. We're all friends here, I'm sure. So we'll start off with the pre. So where did we get to? If we go back long enough, we used to have, and some of you may remember, the Fire Precautions Act. We had certification. We had workplace regs where you had to do risk assessments for employees around fire. We had about 197 bits of legislation, including the Housing Act, including the Building Act and the building regulations. But 197 bits of legislation was very complicated. And so under the Regulatory Reform Order, we introduced the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which basically tidied up all that legislation into a single regulatory regime, which enabled us to enforce a little bit more consistently and clearly, and allowed the responsible person to comply a little bit more easily. But consistency was the key around that change. As well as that move to one regulatory regime, there was also still some other legislation that did have some fire safety attachments, and that includes the Housing Act, the building regs and the Building Act still. Okay, so since 2005, the Fire Safety Order has been the main bit of legislation that the Fire Authority enforces in relation to fire safety. But those of you that are looking after housing stock, you will also have to, as I'm sure you know, comply with the Housing Act. Those of you that are building or making amendments will be aware you have to comply with the Building Act and building regulations. But they're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is making people as safe as reasonably practicable from fire. And so that's what we're all here to do. And that's what I'm going to try to assist with this presentation. And incidentally, before I forget, those of you that have any ideas around other webinars that you think would help, please let us know. We're open to receive ideas and we're happy to assist. With regards to the inspection regimes, I think it's fair to say that pre-Grenfell housing stock specifically were not top of our risk inspection regime. We focused our efforts and time on hotels, care homes, hospitals, those sort of areas. We didn't look commonly at high-rise buildings, for example. Local authority housing teams use the Housing Act to look at those, especially standalone ones. And so it's fair to say that they maybe weren't as regulated as they are now. I think that's a fair comment. At the same time as all those legislative changes, we had some government agenda changes. So the government were trying to deregulate. There was an assumption of compliance with legislation. There was a move to deregulate. There was, I think it was one new bit of legislation to result in one removed bit of legislation, and that evolved into, one in, lots removed. And so we had a deregulation push nationally. We also had ongoing financial pressures in the community, in the business community, in the housing stock, etc. as well. So we had all those pressures, which did result in a reduction in standards. Okay, that's been proven. That's not me being contentious. That's been proven by the Grenfell Tower outcomes, which we'll come on to in a second. And I think, if we're all honest, we would agree that did result in some reductions in oversight and reductions in standards. That manifested itself in numerous incidents, even before Grenfell. But it was Grenfell that created the big seismic change that we are all still going through now. So what did happen after Grenfell? We had a almost immediate review carried out by Dame Judith Hackett, which we'll come on to in a second. That resulted in a report called Building a Safer Future, which the government consulted on, and that resulted in a huge amount of recommendations that were needing and still need to be fully implemented. We also had the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which we have recently received the phase 2 recommendations. And I'd like to just park that for a second. We will come to the phase 2 recommendations towards the end of this presentation, but we also received the phase 1 recommendations a few years ago now, and those have been mainly implemented and have resulted in some significant changes. Next slide, please. So what changes have we seen? This slide is just, we're going to rattle through this slide because it's just quickly showing you that the central legislation there, the Fire Safety Order, so the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, has been changed. We had the Fire Safety Act came in 2021. We had the Fire Safety England regs came in, and actually it's called 2022, but they actually came in 2023. And we had a Building Safety Act came in 2022 and then had a rolling implementation. So the Fire Safety Act and the Building Safety Act stem directly from the Hackett Review, whereas the Fire Safety England regulations stem directly from the Grenfell Tower inquiry. And that's why those of you that have seen that legislation will notice that most of the Fire Safety England regulations are related to improvements that could help fire crews and fire services operationally should any of these type of incidents happen again. and we'll come on to what those are a little bit later. Whereas the Fire Safety Act and the Building Safety Act provided legislative clarity and improvements that helped to implement some of the recommendations from the Dame Judith Hackett report. Next slide, please. So the first of those was the Fire Safety Act 2021. I think those of you on the call that are involved in risk assessments and have been for many years, I think it's probably fair to say that it was a rarity for fire risk assessments in buildings to consider the external wall. Okay, and there was also confusion, wasn't there, around whether the doors to flats, front doors to flats, were to be included in the fire risk assessments for the buildings, or whether they sat purely as a domestic outside of the legislation. There was a load of other areas of confusion, such as around balconies. Are they to be considered? Are they a risk? And so the Fire Safety Act came in and clarified that all of those things I've just mentioned are squarely held within the regulatory reform fire safety order, and the risk for them needs to be considered in your fire risk assessments. So every fire risk assessment needed to be reviewed that didn't already have this information in there to include this new information. And so you could imagine that when this came out in April 21, for those organizations that had a large portfolio of premises, they would need to do a significant amount of work to review their risk assessments. So we were mindful of that and still are mindful of that. And so there was a prioritization created that allowed these businesses to input the details of their buildings, and they would get a prioritized guide come out the other end. And that would allow them to gradually get their risk assessments up to speed for their various building portfolios. The important thing for this one, though, for me, it clarified the ongoing issue around front doors and the fact that doors need to be included in the fire risk assessments. The front doors to flats are probably the most important, well, fire doors anywhere are, for me, one of the most important requirements of fire safety legislation. Front doors to flats are extremely important, as I'm sure we're all in agreement about now. Next slide, please. There was also then the Building Safety Act, which is a huge bit of legislation. It came in April 22, and it has fundamentally and continues to fundamentally change the fire safety and building safety landscape in our country. It has changed the Building Act, it has changed regulations, it has introduced a raft of regulations, but significantly it's introduced a new high risk regime and a new regulator. And so when we talk about high risk buildings now under this Act, we're talking about at the moment, and we'll come back to this with the Grenfell 2 recommendations, at the moment we're talking about in occupied buildings, high-rise residential buildings over 18 metres or 7 floors or above. Yeah, they now come under an additional regime that is enforced by the Building Safety Regulator, which sits within the Health and Safety Executive. So please be aware that is an additional, not a replacement to the fire safety order requirements that the fire service enforce. But please be also reassured that we are mindful of not going back to the situation we were in years ago of having so many bits of legislation and so many regulators that it was impossible to comply with. So we are engaging closely with the new regulator to make sure that what we do with regards to enforcement of the order and enforcement of the Act is done collaboratively, okay, for the sake of those people responsible for those buildings. That Act also introduced the requirement for these high-risk buildings to register, and they should all have registered by October last year. And that is to allow the regulator to understand the scale of the number of buildings in scope that need to be assessed for a building certificate. As part of that process, people will be contacted to say that their building is now being looked at, called in as it's called, and they will need to produce various bits of documentation such as safety cases, which is basically a document which explains how that building is going to be managed from cradle to grave, what risks are in that building, and how they're communicating with residents to make them aware of that risk, etc., etc. So it's a real step forward in my view around managing risk in high-rise buildings, high-rise residential buildings. Now, with regards to new buildings, there's also a new process being brought in under this Act, and that you'll hear people talking about gateways, gateway 1, 2, 3. In essence, it's a stop-go process that controls how these high-risk buildings are designed and built, and what checks are put in place to make sure they are being built as agreed, and making sure that they have been built as agreed before they are occupied. Linked into that is what you may have heard reference to, the golden thread of information. So buildings should all have recorded information around fire risk in their buildings and some other information. And that information, that golden thread of information, should be available to those who need it and should be passed on year on year to others who need it going forward. There is also a requirement to provide key information to residents and to engage with residents. If you remember Grenfell, there was the big criticism around, residents not being listened to. And so there's a requirement in these high risk buildings for residents to be engaged with, to have a resident engagement strategy put in place. So lots of new requirements coming in under the Act, but there was also a section 156 of that Building Safety Act, which in a nutshell made changes to the fire safety order. So you may remember that historically, if you didn't employ 5 or more people, you didn't have to record a fire risk assessment, as one example. All of that is gone. It's simplified. You need to record your fire risk assessment and you need to record your arrangements, so your policy, etc. It doesn't mean you have to have a massive, complicated document. It still needs to be proportionate to the risk and the building that we're talking about. So a small shop, we would expect the risk assessment to be small, and we would expect the arrangements, the policies, etc., to be small. A large multinational company with multiple businesses and premises around the country, we would expect it to be a lot larger, obviously. There was also in that section the requirement to ensure that those carrying out risk assessments are competent. That is the only bit that hasn't been implemented yet from this section 156, and that has also reared its head in the phase 2 recommendations we'll come back to at the end. There is also a requirement for information to be provided to fire and rescue services and others. There is a requirement for the AP and RP, responsible person, to cooperate with each other, to proactively go out and try and find out who else is responsible for different parts of the buildings where there's multiple people responsible, and to pass information on to new responsible or APs as they come in. There was also a more financial change in there around moving the financial penalties to unlimited fines. So there were limits on some offences and what people could be fined. That's now changed and it's unlimited. So that reflects the increase in seriousness placed on compliance with fire safety. Next slide, please. So the third bit of legislation is around the Fire Safety England regs, and this is the one, as I said previously, came in really from the recommendations from Grenfell, and it's based around the operational improvements. So there was a clear requirement for the responsible person to provide us with information, to provide information to residents, and the whole idea of this is to make sure that residents and responding emergency services are aware of the risks in these buildings, aware of the facilities in these buildings, so that when they turn up, they're able to utilize them and be more effective in their operational response. In all multi-occupied buildings, so this legislation was proportionate. It basically said the higher the building, the more we're going to ask you to do. So in all multi-occupied buildings, residential buildings, residents should now be provided with the fire safety instructions and information on fire doors. So regardless of the height of your residential building, every resident should understand what the fire doors are there to do. I go back to my previous statement about how important fire doors are. That's reflected here. And also what they need to do should they come across a fire or have a fire in their flat. Every resident should be clear on that, and we check that when we come and do audits in these buildings now. On top of that, in medium rise, which is 11 meters or over, the responsible person is required to undertake annual checks of the flat entrance doors and quarterly checks of the fire doors in the common parts. So these are not testing, these are not fire door tests, these are checks that there are some guidance documents out there that will explain the difference. But in essence, is the door doing what it's meant to be doing? Is it secure? Are there holes in it? Are the strips and seals missing? Is the door closing fully? Is there a self-closer there? So is the door going to be able to behave as we hope it behaves in a fire, should a fire occur, obviously? And then on top of that, in high rise, it ramps up again. The responsible person is, in addition to those we've just mentioned, they're required to provide the fire service with up-to-date electronic plans and information on the design and material of the external wall. So we want to know what's in that external wall because we want to know how we're going to deal with it operationally should we turn up and it's on fire, basically. We want to make sure that the facilities provided in these flats, such as firefighting lifts, if you go above 18 meters, you're likely to have a firefighting lift. So we want to make sure that they're checked and working. We want to make sure that other key pieces of firefighting equipment, such as risers, which are the pipes that go up through the building to allow us to provide water to our crews at high level. We want to make sure those are working, etc., etc. I think you get the point. The other key one is the ventilation in these buildings, to make sure that the ventilation is working. We also want to make sure that our crews can find their way to the right flat. So wayfinding signage is also now a requirement in high rise. So some of you may be aware that the approved document was updated to require new builds of high rise to have wayfinding signage. This almost makes it, well, it does, it makes it retrospective, but through a different bit of legislation. So high rise existing need to have wayfinding signage in there. And there is some guidance, which we'll come to at the end, that shows you what type of signage we're talking about here. In addition, and finally on this bit, we also require secure information boxes. You may have seen them, they're the red boxes that you see in buildings. In there, they're sort of fireproof boxes that we have access to. And in there, we want to have copies of the floor plans that show the layout of the building, what facilities are in the building. And there, so that we can brief our crews who are going to go wear breathing apparatus, we can brief them on a plan where we want them to go and how they're going to get there. Okay, some responsible people are also adding into these boxes where vulnerable people may be. That's useful information, voluntary at the moment, useful information for us to have, because if we know there is a vulnerable person in the flat next to the flat on fire, then we will need to be allocating resources to do something about that, sooner rather than later. Hopefully that makes sense. Next slide, please. So I talked about where this guidance can be found. There is a lot of guidance on our website, which we'll come to at the end, and there is a lot of guidance on government website. But in essence, what you've got there is a list of 12 parts of the regulation, the Fire Safety England regulations, that provide that confirmation of what I've just said. Yeah. Secure information boxes, what's on external walls, floor plans, lifts, signage, information to residents, your fire door checks, and providing information to the fire authority. That's enshrined within that legislation. And incidentally, those of you that are more legally aware on the call, you will notice that the regulations themselves don't have any offences in there. That is because those regulations were brought in under the Fire Safety Order Article 24, and so the offences and the prosecution routes are done through the Fire Safety Order and that route. So we would issue enforcement notices and we would prosecute under the Fire Safety Order for any offences under the Fire Safety England regs. So let's just talk quickly about what do we actually want from responsible people. It can seem very complicated, and in some buildings it's going to be, but in most buildings it should be straightforward. And the legislation, I like to think, is straightforward. We want responsible people to provide a reasonable level of general fire precautions in their buildings. What does that mean? Well, we want them to make sure that they are reducing the risk of fire as much as possible, and reducing the risk of fire spread as much as possible. So that starts to talk about fire doors and doors to flats and staircases and compartment walls and all these other bits that should a fire occur, we don't want it to spread too fast, and we definitely don't want it to go into the means of escape that prevents people from escaping. So we want that means of escape to be protected. We want it to be large enough to accommodate the numbers in the building, and we want the distance that people have to travel along that means of escape to be as short as possible, don't we? And there are limits on that before you would then have to introduce another means of escape. The golden rule on all fire safety, and apologies fire risk assessors on the call, I'm giving the trade secret away here, but in essence, whenever you're looking at fire risk, all you're looking to do is place a fire virtually, not for real, virtual fire in a building, and then make sure everyone in that building can turn their back on that fire and get away. That's what we're trying to achieve by introducing all these measures. We're also trying to introduce a way that the responsible person can mitigate or fight fires. And that is why in most commercial premises where you have staff who can be trained, you will find firefighting equipment, fire extinguishers, etc. You do not require them in blocks of flats, obviously, because you haven't got employees that you can train to use them. And the common area in a block of flats is meant to be sterile, so there shouldn't be a fire in there. Okay. Now, fire detection is an important one because we want people to be made aware of the fire, obviously, in enough time to allow them to either escape or get to a point of relative safety, as we call it. So get away from the fire so that they're not in immediate danger. It's really important that the type of fire detection in the building is appropriate for the building and appropriate for the evacuation procedure in that building. Okay, I'll come on to it again in the next slide, but I'm going to say it here. There is a lot of talk, isn't there, nationally around the need for detection in blocks of flats. Now, as we sit here, we got to remember that blocks of flats are designed so that a fire in a flat should stay in a flat for a period of time to allow the fire crews to attend and extinguish it. So if there is a fire in a flat, there is no need for the rest of the building to evacuate normally. And therefore, we don't want an alarm in a block of flats that goes off because one of the flats is on fire. Because, of course, if you're hearing alarm, you're going to want to escape. That's human behavior. That's natural. But for that strategy to work, we need to make sure that the compartmentation, the reducing the risk of fire spread, the means of escape, is all top notch and is being well maintained. Please be reassured that if we turn up to a fire in a block of flats and the fire has spread beyond the flats, we will be evacuating other parts of the building and potentially the whole of the building. And measures are being implemented nationally around how we could do that more effectively going forward. It's really important then in the workplace, and we talked earlier about residents in blocks of flats, that people are told what to do in the event of a fire. And then for staff, that training is provided for all roles to enable the emergency procedure to be implemented effectively. Okay, that training bit is critical. Okay, you have an emergency procedure. It may involve having somebody in charge of the evacuation. It may involve somebody like a fire warden assisting in the evacuation, and you'll have members of staff who are either just evacuating or assisting members of the public in evacuating as well. So what we are looking for with regards to training is induction training to explain to new staff their building and the facilities in there and the means of escape to keep them safe. And then additional training that trains the people on what to do in the event of an incident. And then additional training, or it could be blended in together, for people who have particular roles to play in that evacuation. So when we come and do our audits, we look and ask for evidence and information on that training. That's particularly important, as you can imagine, in hospitals and care homes and other places where you've got vulnerable people who are bedridden. The need for highly trained members of staff in numbers required to evacuate people is critical, and that training is really important. So what is reasonable? I talked about doing everything reasonable. What is reasonable? Well, that's where the guidance comes in. And just to be clear, the guidance now has a higher threshold. or a higher standing in law. Yeah, courts will look at the guide and will basically say, have you complied with the guidance? If you have, you're likely to have complied with the law. If you haven't, you're likely not to have complied with the law unless you can prove otherwise. So use the guidance as that benchmark to confirm to yourselves what is needed in your buildings. It's then really important that those records, risk assessments, policies, etc., are recorded. It's a legal requirement for everyone now. And most importantly for me is that the risk assessments and the arrangements are reviewed. So there's a common question, isn't there, about, well, how frequently should we review? The ballpark figure has always been a year. Yeah, annually you should review your risk assessment, maybe tie it in with your health and safety risk assessment reviews. But the reality is those risk assessments should be reviewed whenever the risk assessment is deemed not to be appropriate, when something significant changes, maybe after you've had an incident, maybe after a new member of staff who's got mobility issues joins your organisation, maybe after there's been an alteration to the layout of your building, or a new piece of equipment has been installed. Something like that may result in a review of your risk assessment, but doesn't necessarily mean you have to rewrite the whole risk assessment. The risk assessment may just need tweaking and amending. Okay, but the real final thing I'll say on risk assessments is please make sure that you don't think of the risk assessment as just a document that contains a list of all your risks. It's meant to have an action plan that is then worked through to complete the actions in there. So the amount of times I've seen risk assessments that have an action plan, but there's no resources allocated and no timescales given for those actions to be completed. So please make sure you utilize the action plan from a risk assessment as almost a project plan to reduce risk in your buildings. And then also don't fall into the trap of finding a risk and suggesting it's going to take 2 years to get the money to deal with that risk, and then not doing anything about the risk while you're waiting for that money to be gained. You need to do something about the risk in the short term while you're waiting for the longer term solution to be implemented. Okay. And then finally on this page, we have those new requirements that have come in under the Building Safety Act and the Fire Safety England regs. I won't go through those again, but they are in addition to those I've just mentioned above. You know, the provision of the secure information boxes, the checking of the doors, the provision of information to residents, all of those sort of things. And key one I want to just mention here is when you have a bit of firefighting equipment, such as a lift, a hydrant, a rising main, a ventilation system, sprinklers. When that system is broken for more than 24 hours, you legally have to let the fire and rescue service know. And you can guess why that is. Obviously, that would impact our response capability, and we may have to change what resources we send to that building until those facilities are fixed. Hopefully that made sense. Can we go next slide? Because I just want to talk through a few common issues we're having to flag to you under the guise of pleading with you to maybe focus in on these areas when you review your risk assessments. So risk assessments not reviewed, no action plan. I'll mention it again there deliberately because it's one of the most common issues we find. Fire doors, yeah, got to make sure that they're closing properly, that they're sound in construction, that they have strips and seals where required, self-closers. Basically, it's common sense fire safety. You need to look at your fire doors and make sure that the doors close and that they're going to keep a fire on one side of that door for a period of time that will allow others to escape on the non-fire side. That's all we're talking about here. And then linked into that is the compartmentation, which is in essence the walls, the floors, the ceilings, and that's the same principle. We want them secure. We don't want holes in these compartments, because you can have a lovely, what's meant to be a 60-minute compartment line. So a nice wall that is meant to keep a fire back for 60 minutes. And you will then have maybe cables, ducts, just general holes through damage, through that compartment wall. And of course, don't keep the fire back for 5 minutes, never mind 60 minutes. And if you are relying on that fire being kept back to enable you to get people out who maybe are mobility impaired, then it's going to be very dangerous, because that fire and smoke will be coming into the area where you are trying to carry out that evacuation. Please make sure the fire alarms are suitable for your strategy. We're still finding evacuation strategies in buildings, simultaneous evacuation in flats, which is fine. But what we shouldn't have is a stay put policy in a flat where the alarms are heard throughout. There's a conflict there, there's a confusion, and we're forever getting residents, understandably, reaching out to us to say they're confused on what they need to do in their blocks of flats. Okay, it is particularly an issue in blocks of flats or sheltered accommodation. Okay, so just maybe focusing on that and make sure the alarms complement the evacuation strategy. Make sure your facilities are maintained. Legal requirement to let us know if they're broken after 24 hours. We are still finding significant amounts of sleeping in unsuitable premises. Being open and honest, what we're finding is that there are people sleeping above commercial premises, and their only route out is to get through that commercial premises, and it's a single direction of travel. Okay, so if there's a fire in the commercial, the people sleeping above are in essence trapped. Of course, we're going to come down to that premises, and we're going to prohibit the use of that building or the use for sleeping. We will take measures to protect people in that building. So please have a look and make sure that those behaviours don't creep into some of your buildings. We also still have a lack of emergency procedures. We have people still not creating emergency procedures or not training people on those emergency procedures. We have people not carrying out fire drills. We would suggest annual fire drills, or if you're working at night, twice a year fire drills, because the resources are less at night usually, and the demands on those people working at night are usually greater. Please make sure your risk assessments consider vulnerable people. Okay. Please make sure there is a means and a way for those people to get to a point of safety in all your buildings. Okay, that is a legal requirement. And please make sure you have adequate numbers of staff to implement your emergency procedure as well. That's a particular challenge for care homes and some other medical establishments at the moment. Next slide, please. So phase 2 recommendations, I promise you I'll come back to it. This is obviously very new outs. This is just a very quick overview and a flavour of what's being recommended. I'm sure some of you have looked at this. There's 58 recommendations, 15 are more at a national governmental level, 14 are to do with fire and rescue services, and they're not all fire safety related. Some of these are operationally related as well. There are 18 required or recommendations within the building industry, the construction industry. There are 3 for the local resilience forum, which is a forum made up of local authorities and emergency responders to enable them to work closely together. And then there are 8 specific for local authorities to allow them to ensure that they are better placed to respond to the type of incidents such as Grenfell, where you have a lot of displaced people. Okay, so the highlights of that are that they are proposing to have 1 regulator that deals with the construction industry, and 1 chief construction advisor. Again, these are recommendations, and there is no requirement for the government to comply with them. But the government are now considering these recommendations and will respond within the next 6 months on their views and their actions from them. So 1 regulator. What that means with regards to the building safety regulator and the fire service regulating a different legislation, we don't know at the moment. We simply don't know. There is a requirement to review the approved document in many areas. There is a push to move away from defaulting to stay put in residential buildings, and more to assess the building to see whether it's suitable for a stay put or whether a simultaneous evacuation is more appropriate. There is a push again for personal emergency evacuation plans to be considered in these buildings, including residential buildings. And the government are going to be responding on that shortly. There's a secondary piece of legislation going to be coming out around that. We await that to come out before we comment further on it. All risk assessors, as recommended, are accredited going forward and competent, and we're still waiting for clarity on what is meant by competent. Okay, that's still up in the air. From a fire service perspective, we would deem someone competent if the risk assessment is suitable and sufficient. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing there, but in essence, there is no requirement at the moment for people to have various qualifications to do risk assessments. We would look to see what the risk assessment is like, whether it has done the job it's designed to do, and then by definition, if it has been done by somebody who is competent in our eyes. There is a push to license all contractors who are working on high-risk buildings. There is a push to have fire strategies required in high-risk buildings. And there is a push to review the nature of building control nationally. So just very quickly, building control was split years ago and can be done by both local authorities and private entities, approved inspectors. There is a push for that to be reviewed to see if it needs to come within one national body that is public as opposed to private with commercial interests. That's the idea behind it. There is a big push to strengthen the testing regime and to strengthen the information on test certificates, and to make sure that the test certificates are suitable and are being assessed regularly with the regulator. And then I talked about the actions on supporting displaced people for local authorities. Finally, the last thing I want to say on this is also a push. You've heard me mention high-risk buildings, and I gave you the definition of that earlier. There is a big recommendation to expand the definition of high-risk buildings. They want to move away from it just being height, 18 meters and 7 stories, or 7 stories, to a building that has vulnerable people. So that may bring into play buildings such as care homes, hospitals, etc., into the new regulatory regime. We'll wait and see whether that manifests itself, but that is a clear recommendation. Next slide, please. So lots of guidance, I promised you. I won't go through them all here, but there are proportionate guidance available, some new, some existing, for the type of buildings you are looking after. There are some new small guides because it was recognised that the historic guides were maybe too weighty for smaller buildings, and so we have small guides there for small blocks of flats, small paying guest accommodation, and small non-domestic premises. There are more coming. There is a whole rewrite of the national guides that some of you will be familiar with happening at the moment. There is a plan to split those out into one generic guide and then a smaller specific guide for the different building types as well. So you can see the trend here to simplify and shorten some of the guidance. Next slide, please. Please take a note of this web address. All of the information you need to comply is contained on our website. Please go and have a look at the website, and by all means provide feedback to us on that website. We're always looking to improve it, but I'm confident that all the information I've covered today is on that website. But should you have any queries and questions remaining, then you can always get in touch with us. Okay, and on that note, next slide, please.
We've just got one final slide for you. And if you are part of a business and you feel that your business would benefit from more support from a dedicated source, East Sussex Fire and Rescue Service and the Fire Authority provide a primary authority partnership scheme. And this is facilitated on a not-for-profit basis and enables a two-way relationship that tailors fire safety requirements to your specific business needs and provides ongoing support with a dedicated single point of contact. If you wanted to find out some more information about that, you can visit our website, www.esfrs.org, or email primaryauthority@esfrs.org. And that is, I think, it. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you tuning in for our next webinar, which will be published soon.